Hello, everybody. Pascal here from Neutrality Studies, and let's discuss yesterday's meeting that happened on August 18th, 2025 in the White House. A meeting that was originally supposed to be happening only between Donald Trump and Volodymyr Zelensky, but that turned into a full-blown congregation of the so-called Coalition of the Willing. It was in the end, it then included also Mark Rutte from NATO, Ursula von der Leyen from the EU Commission, of course, Germany's Merz, France's Macron, Italy's Meloni, and funnily, Mr. Starmer from the UK, and funnily enough, and most interestingly enough, it also included Mr. Alexander Stubb from Finland. Now, Mr. Stubb's presence was definitely the most odd one. I mean, the other ones are all understandable. On the one hand, you have the three largest economies of the European Union, you have the UK, you have NATO and the EU representatives. But then why Stubb? Why Finland? And this was so odd that Mr. Stubb, towards the end of the meeting, when he was given the word, even had to explain himself. And to me, it is still unclear what exactly the purpose was. He said that due to the long border that they're sharing, 800 miles, he even explained it in U.S. terms, right? Not in kilometers, but in miles. That Finland has a lot of experience of dealing with the Russians, and that they themselves, of course, also came to a agreement to end a war back in 1944. Now, this aspect, this mentioning 1944, to me was really quite extraordinary, because in 44 Finland, of course, basically capitulated. It wasn't a capitulation, it was an armistice, it was an agreed end to the what the Finns call the continuation war, in which Finland, of course, had teamed up with Nazi Germany and had Nazi soldiers on its territory, was fighting together with the Nazis against the Soviet Union and it's called a continuation war for them, because it was the second war against the Soviet Union after in 1939-40 they were fighting the Winter War with where they were attacked by the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union took and clipped away important parts of the Finnish territory. Then they came to an armistice, and then when the Germans attacked the Soviet Union, the Finns then joined the Germans, right, in attacking again. And then in 1944, they met with the Russians, with the Soviets in Moscow, and negotiated an armistice, and that then in the end led to Finland's de facto neutralization in the Cold War, and turned everything back to the borders of that were agreed in the armistice of 1940. Right. So on the one hand, this is a very ominous historical background to maybe what is going on now. On the other hand, if we were conspiratorially minded, which we are not, but if we were, we would really wonder if we are seeing some form of scheming already going on for handing over the baton from Ukraine to the next proxy war. But let's suppose that that's not what's happening. We are not seeing any kind of preparations for opening up another front. But honestly, I was very surprised that the Stubb Finland, and the previously neutral country until 2022, a neutral country in Europe, is included in this entire talk. And it was so odd that Donald Trump himself twice nearly forgot that Stubb was there. First, in the beginning of the meeting, he was introducing everybody, and at the end, he also introduced Mr. Stubb. But then he was looking around in the room and said, "Where is he? Where is he?" When in fact, Mr. Stubb was sitting right in front of him. It was a long table. You see it here. Right, a relatively long table, and Mr. Stubb, that's this guy here, was sitting right next to Volodymyr Zelensky, and basically right in front of Donald Trump. So Trump was obviously not familiar with this face, and in the second part, like when Trump handed the word to each one of these so-called leaders and let them talk a little bit, and when at the very end he was already wrapping up the meeting, when he realized that he had forgotten Stubb, and then said like, "Okay, here you go. please also say something, Alexander. And he let him talk, and then also commended him on his youthfulness, that he looks very young. So you can see how Trump somehow was clearly not familiar with this face, clearly not, and just said the first best thing that came to his mind when he tried to give Mr. Stubb the word after forgetting about him almost twice. This meeting, in this sense, was quite interesting, not just for Finland, also for the way in which it was conducted. I will link this video. It's up on the White House, right, which streamed and gives us access to the entire about 30 minutes or so. Again, it was Mr. Trump sitting in the middle and then giving the word one by one to each one of these people, who then try to bring across their point. This is, to my understanding, how the entire meeting between these people started. They then afterwards went into private deliberations. This also comes after a one-on-one meeting between the team of Donald Trump and the team of Mr. Zelensky. So they had previously a talk also which included, that we've learned about, a map, a battlefield map that Donald Trump prepared, apparently, and that Mr. Zelensky alluded to and said, like, thank you very much for bringing that up. That was very helpful. And we were able to talk about battlefield realities. So in the tete-a-tete between Trump and Zelensky, obviously, Mr. Trump tried to bring across a couple of realities of the battlefield and discuss those with Team Zelensky. And this, to me, alludes to Trump having actually understood the Russian point that was made in the meeting between him and Vladimir Putin on Friday, right? That there are certain battlefield realities and certain land recognition of territories that they won't get around. Now, in this meeting, they weren't talking about concessions, the territorial swaps or whatnot, but we can already infer that this was a substantial part of the discussion, especially with the Ukrainians. But now the fact that the Ukrainians brought along the entire European I don't know even what to call them. I mean, they call themselves the coalition of the willing because, of course, not all members of NATO are on board of what is happening. We know that Hungary is not at all a fan. We know that Slovenia is not a fan of Slovakia is not a fan of what's going on. The Fico and Orban, and here we have the main perpetrators, right, of the prolongation of the war. Now, the way they tried to frame themselves is, of course, as people who've never been hoping for anything else but peace, and then they go into their usual tirade about how Russia is to blame for this, but they do it in an interesting fashion because the Europeans understood that Donald Trump is now having a increasingly good relationship with Vladimir Putin, with the Russians, and hence in this meeting and in this presentation, they really dialed down the tirades. They emphasized actually what Donald Trump wants them to emphasize, which is the need to bring about peace. And you can see how the different types, these different people tried to just give peace another kind of flavor. Especially people like Mr. Merz, who kept saying that peace can only be achieved through a ceasefire, something that Mr. Trump pushed back on very strongly and said he claimed that he had ended 6 wars so far in his or has been involved in the ending of 6 wars, and in none of them a ceasefire was actually necessary to get to a final peace agreement. I will not talk so much about what Trump here means with his 6 wars. He really also includes, for instance, Armenia and Azerbaijan as a great example for how he got to a peace agreement. He's then referring, of course, to the signing of this kind of letter of intent recently at the White House between Armenia and Azerbaijan. But there, that war, I mean, had already had the shooting had already ended, right? The shooting there was no shooting going on at the moment when the Trump administration stepped in. So let's set this one aside and let me more talk about what we learn about the relationship also between the United States and Europe. And it is at this point and from this meeting also utterly clear that here what we are seeing is the boss telling his employees to show up in his office. Apparently, he only wanted to talk with one of the employees, but all of them showed up, and then he made the best out of it. So he made a boardroom meeting out of it, because that's more or less what he conducted. He, the boss, sits in the middle, and then he listens to each one of his employees. The number one employee came first, and that was Mark Rutte, the guy here on the left-hand side, sitting next to Volodymyr Zelensky, who he wanted to hear from first. And Mark Rutte, being Rutte, the man who called Donald Trump the daddy, right, who has to look after his children, he started by praising Donald Trump and how great he's doing. And in return, Donald Trump has actually called Mark very good and well done. He talked to him not like a child, but really like a boss, like one of my subordinates who's good at executing, at doing what he does. It was quite extraordinary. And again, like, then Rutte basically going into this very strong praise and saying that it is Trump's effort that is bringing about here, that is ending a deadlock. He says he ended the deadlock with Russia because the Russians weren't willing to negotiate. That's what the Europeans right now try to portray, and that's also what, of course, mainstream media has been trying to portray, although the Russians all along said, like, we're always open for negotiations, always open for discussions, just talk to us. And actually, they had. I mean, if you argue that Russia wasn't willing to negotiate, it's just simply not true. The Chancellor of Austria, back in 2022, it was about June, or I think it was around June or so, when he went to Moscow and actually was the first EU leader to meet with Vladimir Putin since February 2022. The Chancellor of Austria went. So and the Russians never said no to diplomatic negotiations. They only said no to a ceasefire and withdrawal and the surrender conditions that the Europeans put up. That's what the Russians said no to, but they never said no to diplomacy. But again, like, the Europeans are now trying to frame it like that, and the people here present, also von der Leyen and especially Meloni, she emphasized that it is of course the great diplomatic skill of Donald Trump that is bringing back the Russians to the table. And the Trump looked, I mean, he obviously loves praise, and he appreciated this praise, and Mr. Rutte is very good at heaping in him with praise. And then he and all the others, all of them, actually emphasize that they are grateful for the United States agreeing to giving security guarantees. Now, Trump was always very careful, especially in his statement. He said that there needs to be security for Ukraine, and that the United States will do its part, but that it was the Europeans that, of course, have to step in first and foremost. So what I take away from this is that the Trump administration really is trying very hard to not promise themselves any kind of hard security guarantees, whereas the Europeans are trying to push that point, and the Trump administration is basically playing with that. He's basically giving him a little bit and saying, like, okay, so you want security guarantees? Sure, we can discuss security guarantees. And then the Europeans leave at that and go like, oh yeah, he said there will be security guarantees. Yay! We're going to have an Article 5 for Ukraine, and we can continue the war. It's going to be fantastic because the Americans going to send troops. But that's, of course, not what the US game is. I mean, you can clearly see how the US is trying to it's not just trying, he is stringing along the Europeans at the US terms, while always escaping their main demands. And one demand, so the first demand that comes up from all of these people is security guarantees. The second demand is the ceasefire. Not all of them emphasized that. Again, it was mainly Merz and von der Leyen who want a ceasefire. The others kind of dropped that talking point, at least in their direct and televised statements. They were, of course, all very aware that here the cameras are rolling, and you must be very careful not to insult the U.S. president while I mean, anywhere, and especially when the media is present. So we need to take everything they said with a big grain of salt. But you can see how they tried to basically please the boss. They really wanted to please the boss, be the good little dogs that they are and have to be in order to not lose the support of the US. And also, they by now have understood that if they don't play along, the US will connect their unwillingness to bend to the to the ideas of Donald Trump, that Trump might react to that with tariffs, right? So there's all types of things that are in the room, and Mr. Trump actually said so. He, when addressing Ursula von der Leyen, he said like, we just struck a great tariff deal, right? And then Ursula had to praise him for that. She had to say like, yes, and it's a very great deal that Europe did with the US, and it's of course it's a surrender. That deal, I mean, she has been so harshly criticized in all of the European media, and now when meeting the US president again, she again has then to praise that extortionist. Well, you cannot really call it an agreement. It's more a dictate, right? It's a U.S. dictate on what kind of terms the U.S. will still allow the Europeans to have some sort of trade with the U.S. But she had to praise it, right? So really, you see the satellites, you see the dogs, the obedient dogs around it. Dog number one being Mark Rutte, right? But then all of the others as well. The attack dog, Mr. Zelensky, who's now in this very awkward position that he's obviously is going to be pressured on giving in to a lot of Russian demands, and also being pressured by the US, because the US wants to bring the proxy war to an end. At least that's what they're saying. If you follow the argumentation of Brian Beletic and others that interpret this moment as one where the US basically dumps the Ukraine war on Europe, and then is going to focus its attention on China, then what this is the getting the Europeans ready to take over that baton, right, and take over the actual battlefield, the Ukrainian battlefield from the US. So it is either the US pressuring the Europeans into agreeing to Russian terms in order to settle the conflict, or it is actually the handing over ceremony in which the Europeans have to again pledge their loyalty, their fealty to Washington, in order then to basically take over from where the US is going to leave, and to implement what Brian Beletic calls the division of labor. And I must emphasize, we don't know which one it is. I still believe that there's a good chance that the United States, the Trump team, and his staff, they actually want to get to a proper great power understanding of the world, divide the spheres of interest among them, and then start doing deals with the Russians again, which would also is, I think, supported by the interpretation of the Russians of what is going on, that even if we cannot dial down the conflict perfectly, at least improve the relationship with the third great power in the entire game, and see if we can get to some business deals again. Russia also changing again some of its laws that would enable ExxonMobil and US investments, or especially in the oil sector and the drilling sector, and to re-enter Russia and to do lucrative business together. So I think the Russians are interpreting it that way. I think a good part of the commentariat out there is interpreting this as the US actually trying to, at least for now, change course. But of course, we don't know. It could be that Brian Beletic is right, and that this is actually the handover ceremony. And that's also why Finland is there. Maybe Finland is going to play an important role in the next phase of what Dmitry Trenin calls already the Third World War, right? The Third World War that is not being fought. And so I must also say Dmitry Trenin is a Russian analyst, a great Western expert, a former chief of he was the Carnegie Foundation Moscow chief, and somebody who worked on transatlantic connections for Russia, right? Somebody who wanted Russia to improve its connections with the West, and he really is very disillusioned, and he already calls this the ongoing Third World War, and this Third World War just plays out in stages. And in his interpretation, maybe what we are seeing here is just the transition from one stage to the next. And again, I hope that is not the case. I hope we are seeing a genuine change in the US attitude toward world and great power balance, the world affairs and great power balance. Now, what else is there to say other than all of these people praised him, and von der Leyen even praised him for his fantastic deal with trade deal with the US. Von der Leyen is then also one of the people who said we need Article 5 type guarantees. And Meloni brought that up again. So did Starmer. They want Article 5 type of security guarantees. And that, of course, alludes to NATO's Article 5, which is the article that says if one is attacked, then all are attacked and everybody will fire back jointly. I must emphasize, though, that Article 5 is overall a very weak collective security article, because it never says that its members actually must commit its military capabilities in order to defend a member. I must underline this, because we sometimes misunderstand Article 5. Article 5 doesn't say that if a member of NATO is attacked, then all other NATO members need to militarily support that member. They say that they need to do everything possible, including military measures. No, they can do everything they want, including military measures. There is no automatism. They are allowed to help militarily, but they don't have to if they don't want. They can support in other ways. So in what we have seen over the last 3.5 years with Ukraine, actually all the help that the NATO members gave to Ukraine is something that they could also give in exactly the same fashion to any individual NATO member that ends up in a war with Russia. So be warned, Finland. Don't count on NATO sending boots on the ground and sending all of its military equipment immediately to you. They don't have to do that. Even a NATO member has no better security military guarantees from NATO than what Ukraine had. So in this sense, the Type 5 security guarantees and security guarantees in overall are, to a large extent, also just diplomatic posturing, because they don't have to send military. They don't have to send troops if they choose not to do so, even under Article 5. But basically what they're asking for is giving to Ukraine something that Russia has already ruled out, right? Russia has clearly said we would consider a NATO membership of Ukraine and is an absolute red line. Russia, though, said that it is open to a security framework and to taking into consideration Ukraine's security concerns. Vladimir Putin on Friday actually said so. Of course, a European security structure will include the security of Ukraine, and they are willing to work toward that. The Europeans at this point is saying they want security guarantees, with which they mean military support guarantees or promises toward Ukraine. And Volodymyr Zelensky obviously is going into exactly the same direction, was going into that direction with his speech. So in a sense, if we are optimistic and think that this is the beginning of the actual winding down of the conflict, then what we are seeing is a harmonizing of the positions, right? Where the Russians talk about indivisible security and a security structure for everybody, and the Europeans still talk about security guarantees, and these guarantees should then be that the United States promises to send and commit its boots and its military capabilities to Ukraine, where we go from there to something that will in the end must be something much closer to the Russian position, to actually understand security guarantees in a larger sense as a guarantee that the security structure will hold. So maybe we are in that process. The Meloni really surprised me in this meeting. She was talking for quite a while, and again, blaming Russia for not being willing to negotiate, and also thanking Trump for his willingness to commit to Ukraine, and actually heaping praise on herself and the Europeans for saying the reason why we are here, the reason why now Russia is willing to talk, is because Trump is a good negotiator, and because we stood together, because we were unified, because we put so much pressure on Russia, and because the battlefield has stalled. This is what's quite fantastic to me. There's a stalemate on the battlefield. So the Russians ran into a brick wall, and because the Europeans erected a brick wall, now the Russians have to talk. That's the ludicrous kind of picture that she is drawing, which again surprises me because Meloni in several times was very critical about this war. But then once she came into power, of course, she did a 180 or a Annalena Baerbock 360, and is now fully online, basically, with the European, like, just insane version of what's going on in the war. Now, I do not think that many share that assessment, especially Donald Trump doesn't, because we know now Trump just explained parts of the battlefield realities or discussed it with Zelensky. I don't think that the US at all sees this, the Trump administration shares the assessment of Meloni, and that Meloni here basically is just, again, also playing to her own audience, saying and telling the Europeans, the European citizens, right, how important these 3.5 years was, then that this is not going to be a lost war, right? This is the shifting, the reframing now of this disaster, this utter catastrophe for Europe, right, in which they themselves are even just second or third rate participants in a US proxy war, and they're just called to Washington, allowed into the office of the boss, in order to kind of have at least rhetorically be part of the not the solution, but the end of the fighting, right? And then of course they now have a need of projecting this not as the failure it is, but as the outcome of their brilliant strategy of standing up to the Russians and erecting a brick wall. So actually also to the Europeans right now, it is important that this war is being ended through a negotiated settlement before the front lines completely collapse, which at the moment they're doing. That's another indication for me that the speed that we are seeing with which this is developing is actually starting to be in the interest of everybody, because the war realities that Russia is not willing to give up is forcing them to come to some form of understanding that would end the fighting through diplomacy, so that they can still claim, if not victory, then at least not a complete loss of their faces, all of them. I believe that overall this was a successful meeting for Donald Trump, because he was able to parade these people around pretty much at will. He still can pretend that the unity is holding, and he can clearly signal the leadership of the United States that NATO is really nothing but a subsidiary arm of US foreign policy, and he has the NATO Secretary General on a very short leash. This is actually very helpful. It's also helpful with the Russians, who of course look at this, and if there was, if Donald Trump wasn't able to command these people, then it would raise doubts in the mind of Moscow, I believe, of how successful any kind of final agreement of what will happen can be if they are going to sabotage this anyhow. But it seems for now that Trump is able to project the necessary unity among the Western Front, which is really the US international front to the outside, right? And basically getting everybody online, even Macron and others, and Starmer, who sometimes float out very outlandish ideas of, boots on the ground in Ukraine and so on, but they didn't do so. The Europeans also, get Macron and so on, they still talk about a lasting and just peace, right? They're still after a just peace, at least in their rhetoric, which so far meant that Russia basically withdraws all of its troops and starts paying reparation and war criminal charges and tribunals against Vladimir Putin. That's what the just peace so far meant. But you can see how at this point these segments are just being carried over in order to not completely let go, to claim that there was consistency over time. We also see that there's a clear process in place, again, because all of the Mr. Trump said in the beginning that the next step will be a bilateral meeting between Zelensky and Putin, and that he's willing to facilitate that. And then actually after this meeting, he even called Vladimir Putin and then told the media that Mr. Putin agreed that there will be a meeting. This is now confirmed also by the Russians. Mr. Ushakov, the aide to Vladimir Putin, actually confirmed that there was a phone call, and that the Russians are willing, how do they phrase it here? Russian presidential aide Yuri Ushakov has confirmed details of the conversation President Vladimir Putin has held with U.S. counterpart Donald Trump, who placed the call to Moscow after pausing a meeting with Ukraine's Vladimir Zelensky and his Western European backers. And he here then says that there's an agreement that there will be some form of further meetings between Ukraine and Russia. It is not entirely clear yet whether they agreed to the meeting on the presidential level, but at least to a good extent, they Russia seems to be signaling that there will be some meeting. It's also a question whether it will be just a bilateral meeting between Zelensky and Putin, or whether Mr. Trump will be involved, as they envisioned it here and as they discussed it at this table with the media. What Mr. Trump would like to see is first a bilateral meeting, Putin and Zelensky, and then a trilateral meeting, including him, Putin and Zelensky. We also see that Trump, though, said, like, Mr. President Zelensky, if you wish me to join you in the first meeting, I will join you. So it is possible that we are looking at a trilateral meeting from the beginning. This might also be actually in the interest of the Russians, who understand that Mr. Zelensky, and who said on the one hand that Mr. Zelensky is not the one to negotiate with, because this is really a structural issue with the United States, and you can only get to security framework and structure with the US. So I would say this is probably more likely that it will be a trilateral meeting from the beginning, because why negotiate with the proxy? Why negotiate with the battlefield provider when who you really want to negotiate with is the relevant counterpart in the actual structural conflict? But we can see how the process at the moment involves, and as a next step in the mind of the US, the direct negotiations between the top level leadership. We also know the Russians are not that big a fan of this. They want to implement any kind of negotiations rather also on a technical level, and they will demand technical levels negotiations for sure. But it's possible that as one of the concessions that the Russians can make in the process is, of course, to say, like, okay, fine, then let's meet with Mr. Zelensky and Mr. Trump in order to give this kind of next photo op to Mr. Trump, and then move the process forward and move to the technical negotiations, and how to also supervise any kind of outcome from this. And again, the Russians are not after only bringing an end to the fighting. They're after a comprehensive security structure for Eurasia, actually, for everybody involved, including the Chinese and the Indians, with whom Mr. Putin is in close contact, right? So the Europeans at this point, they still talk about ending the dying, ending the battlefield realities, but of course the battlefield realities are something that doesn't favor them anymore. So, and I'm very happy that they're saying that. I'm happy that they're saying that we need to bring an end to the dying. It would just have been very nice had they said that back in April 2022, when there was almost an agreement that could have stopped all of the dying. But then it was the Brits and the US that, of course, sank this agreement between the Russians and the Ukrainians. So it is, to my mind, absolutely clear that the Russians will demand that the West, the collective West, is actually on board and actually supports this, and that it's then being implemented through Ukraine the way that the proxy war against Russia was implemented through Ukraine. Now, again, we will need to study why Mr. Stubb was there and what his role was. I will discuss this with Finnish colleagues pretty soon. If any one of you has closer information of what this might have been, please do drop me a line and put your thoughts into the comments, because again, Finland's presence at this meeting kind of makes little sense. Other than expertise in how to surrender without calling it a surrender, or expertise in how to get to the next stage of this conflict with Russia. Let's hope that this is a good sign and not a bad one. We will keep looking at this. Thank you very much for your time today.